Welcome to the show, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. Before we begin today's episode, I want to say thank you to our newest supporters, Valerie and Ashley. We truly appreciate your generosity. If you're interested in supporting the podcast, you can become a patron at patreon.com/paranormal mysteries. Or if you'd prefer to make a one-time donation, please visit buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. As always, subscribing to the podcast and sharing it with your friends is one of the best ways to show your support, and we appreciate it. Now with that being said, let's get ready and start the show. Welcome to the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, and thank you for being here. I am your host, Nick Ryan. Today's first listener story comes to us from Madison. Madison's story is called Hatman or Shadow Person. Madison says, "Hi, I was really young, like elementary school young, maybe 7 or 8. Just about every night before I'd go to bed, I would sit in my family's living room and watch cartoons until I got sleepy. Then I'd head off to bed. I can't recall the first time this happened to me, since it occurred numerous times over the course of a few years, and then it just stopped, all seemingly unprompted and out of nowhere. But some nights, while I'd be sitting watching TV before bed, I would feel like I was being stared at. My body would go semi-stiff, sort of how people freeze up when they're scared, but I really couldn't move at all, except I could turn my head to look around. One room over, always in the same place, I would see a tall, shadowy figure with what varied between a fedora, a top hat, and a cowboy hat, just staring right at me. I could tell it was a man, despite him having no discernible features. He never moved. He never caused anything to move. He never even appeared closer than a room away from me. I also never felt truly scared, as if he were evil, but I knew it wasn't a person, and I knew it shouldn't be in my house, staring at me. It always made me anxious, and I would fight my parents if they tried to make me go to bed while he was there, since I would have to pass that room to get to my bedroom. One day, he just stopped showing up, and I sort of forgot about the entire thing, even though it took place over such a long period of time. Very recently, while scrolling through TikTok, I came across a video of a girl talking about a paranormal game called Red Door, Yellow Door, and when she was discussing the rules, she said, "And if you see a man with a hat, wake up immediately and do not speak to him." And I couldn't explain why at the time, but it sent chills right down my spine. I went into the comments, and I found a few people talking about how they've seen a man with a hat in real life, not just in this game, and I started remembering my own experience with him. I have no idea why this hat man or shadow person visited me the way that he did, or what he wanted. He never harmed me, or even truly frightened me, but it gave me this deeply unsettling feeling. I was honestly shocked to see how many people have seen the same thing that I have, and have had such similar experiences. I felt really drawn to contact you upon listening to your episode on the Hat Man and shadow people in general. Our next listener story comes to us from Anonymous. Anonymous's story is called Sudden Fear of the Dark. Anonymous says, "I've never shared this story before, as the idea of a 30-year-old suddenly becoming scared of the dark seems a bit embarrassing. But since listening to your podcast, I have finally got to a point where I feel that I can share. Ultimately, I want to pick your brains over an experience that I had a few years ago. I live in the southwest of England, in a little town near the city of Bath. The experience that I always wondered about took place over the course of about 2 years. During this time, I was renting what, for the most part, seemed like a lovely old country house, but it was only after moving in that I discovered how very uneasy it felt at nighttime. I found myself, for the first time in my life, at the age of 29 or 30, feeling afraid of the dark. This was an intense feeling while in the house, but especially in the hall, stairs, and landing. I found myself trying to make sure that lights were on throughout the house before it got dark, and systematically turning lights off on my way to bed, so that I was never in the dark, only turning the last light off once I was in bed and had full view of the door to the landing. I am sure that on occasions I heard noises, probably voices, but living in the country in an old house, noises are common anyway, so as I had always done before living in this particular house, I brushed them off as wind in the trees or local wildlife. I think it's important to note that this house was big, but the rent was cheap, so I could comfortably afford it, even though there were a couple of rooms that I only really used as storage space, and very rarely went in, the third bedroom being one of those rooms. That room was at the far end of the landing, and I believe that on occasions I saw movement in that room, though as quickly as I could blink and look to see what it would be gone. What I thought I had seen was almost like a shadow outline with a kind of aura to it. I still don't know what it was, why it was there, or if it was actually there, but I do know that during the 2 years that I lived there, I kept up the same bedtime lights routine and was terrified of the dark. I don't want to describe myself as a skeptic, as I do believe that there are things that we don't really understand, but at the same time, I think that maybe there is a certain bliss to ignorance, so on occasion, I would build up my nerve to try and find out what it was, but I never really looked too hard, as maybe a bit of me didn't want to know, or perhaps something was telling me that I shouldn't. What I do know is that as soon as I moved from there into a different house, that fear of the dark went away, and I felt as strong and confident as I had ever been. I would appreciate your thoughts on this. Perhaps you have heard of similar experiences, or can tell me what was going on. I don't have access to that house anymore, but since discovering your podcast, I have come to a point where I feel some form of understanding of what happened back then. I don't think skepticism is a totally bad thing, but it should be met with enough open-mindedness to change. Many thanks. Anonymous. Our next story of the night comes from Banya. Banya's story is called Red Light. Banya says, "Hello, Nick. I only just discovered your podcast, and I've been binging on it since. So far, I was enjoying just listening to other people's experiences, as I try to stay open-minded to the unknown in this world, and I don't deny its existence. Until I heard Ashley's story from episode 53, which sent chills down my spine. I don't really remember how old I was, but I must have been in my late teens, as I was still living with my parents in a small city in northern Poland, in a 4-story building. We were based on the first floor. From my bedroom window, I had a view of our balcony, 2 very large trees, and the building opposite. Because my bed was positioned just by the window, I could easily kneel on it and look through the window. One night, it must have been summer, as I was remembering those trees being covered with leaves, I had a sudden urge to wake up, which I did. I kneeled on my bed and looked through the window, and I saw the whole outdoor space covered in red light. I instantly felt a bit uneasy, trying to search for the source of the light, but there was none. I remember the light wasn't aggressive, like from a police car or a flare. It wasn't flickering or moving. It was kind of hanging. It amazed me how very evenly it was covering the whole area, so the balcony, trees, and the building in front of me were all covered in red. At some point it became a bit more intense, but again with no source of light, almost like something was hanging, but a bit lower. I remember in my head I was trying to justify what I was seeing. I always associated UFOs with bright lights, like in other stories or in the movies, but the feeling I had that night was that I just knew something wasn't right. Something was off. I remember trying to convince myself that it must be friendly, or at least this is what I wanted to believe, but I don't remember falling asleep or anything else. When I woke up, I remember how real the experience felt, but I didn't tell this to any family members. Many years later, I shared this experience only with my husband. When I came across Ashley's story, I couldn't help but feel how her experience was so very real to me. I played this episode to my husband, and he encouraged me to share my story as well. I still don't know what I saw back then, but I think that it's important to share it so Ashley knows she wasn't alone in her experience. Thank you for your time, Nick, and for this platform, so we can share our stories without being judged. I did experience different paranormal situations, but this one is the most vivid so far. Kindest regards, Vanya. Our next story tonight comes from Tanya. Tanya's story is called Something's There. Tanya says, I have had a few experiences over the years. I never felt in danger, but just unnerved. One was when I was in the bath, soaking, and my dog was laying next to the tub. She suddenly perked up, looked to the corner above the door, and she started to shake and growl. I asked her what was wrong, and she continued to shake and growl while staring up into the corner. Me, just being curious what would happen, spoke up while looking in the corner and said, You are scaring my dog. If you can't stop, then you need to leave. Seconds later, my dog stopped shaking and settled back down like nothing just happened. She has never done that before and hasn't since. I know there's someone or something here, but I don't feel scared or in danger. Thank you for reading my story. I may have to send more. Our next story of the night comes from Ben. Ben's story is called If You Think Your Actions Have No Consequences. Ben says, So in my last email, I told you about my Nana. My family is a large Italian-American family. My grandparents on my father's side consisted of 8 children, 6 girls and 2 boys. My grandparents moved from Brooklyn to Lynbrook, Long Island, to raise their large family, and through the years that house saw a lot of people. This story is about Gino, who couldn't leave. Gino was the boyfriend of the oldest daughter, who my grandparents took in when his family, for one reason or another, didn't want him. They were kind people that way. Gino loved my grandparents and considered this to be his home, and when going to New Jersey to visit his family, he sadly had an asthma attack and passed away. Gino now spent his afterlife wandering around his home. His bedroom was in the attic, now the youngest daughter's room, and at night, you could hear him running up and down the stairs. This was nothing out of the normal for our family, and we joked about it. At this time, I was 12 years old and living with my parents, my grandparents, my youngest aunt, who was not a believer, and my sister. It was a full house of people. Not everyone could see spirits, or are even open-minded to them. That's why I believe my aunt never saw or heard Gino while living in that room for all those years. My experience with Gino is burned into my mind because it was my first. It welcomed me to the world of thinking I was kind of special. Who doesn't want to be special in some way? Anyway, I was 12 and home alone in my room after taking a shower. I remember being home alone because I left my bedroom door wide open while I was in a towel. That's when I saw this white, all white, cloudy figure of a man, just a shape with no definition at all, walk the final steps out of the attic, walk toward my room, and face in my direction. I was in complete shock, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I think he knew he scared the crap out of me because he waved at me and walked into the bathroom. It was the weirdest thing I have ever seen so clear. Years later, I have caught glimpses of people like the little girl in the first story I shared, but never head-on like that. I was now freaked out, so later on my family spoke about Gino with me and told me what happened to him. I found a way to be okay with this, and it became normal, like I said, to have him there. I would even warn my friends who spent the night that there was a ghost in the house, and to not be afraid if you hear weird things or see him. They would always laugh, call me a liar, and poke fun at me, but it always ended up the same. I would wake up in the morning, and they would have left their bunk bed and slept next to me, because they would have heard him running up and down the stairs all night, and it would scare them out of their minds. Gino didn't care about being seen. I think he was trying to get our attention. He would pick up old clothes my grandfather threw out and wear them. That happened only once with a robe, but my grandmother spotted him in it, thinking it was my grandfather. Didn't I tell you to throw that piece of crap away, Anthony? She later realized it wasn't my grandfather. My grandfather had a face and detail. Gino no longer did. He did do something very interesting this one time. He spoke to my mother while she was asleep. This has happened to me with other spirits, so I think it's when we have our guard down, when we sleep. We are more open to them. She went on to hear all these stories of Gino and my father's exploits, inside jokes, conversations only known to the two of them. Gino told her, "Ask Ben about what's her name." My father's name was Ben also. So she did. She woke him up the next day and asked him, "Who is so-and-so?" My father, being confused, asked, "How can you possibly know about her?" "Gino told me," she replied, and then she went on to share all the stories about the two of them. She ended it in such a way that I could never forget. She asked my dad, "When you're alone in the basement, do you ever feel someone touching your ear, flicking it to bother you, to find no one there?" My father did happen to have this happen, and found out it was his friend Gino, letting him know that he was still around. I found that even more amazing. Stuff like this went on for another 3 years or so, until one day my grandmother decided to investigate why Gino was still around. She called his siblings in New Jersey, where he had died, only to find out that they never cared enough to put a tombstone on Gino's grave. Gino couldn't rest, knowing that they didn't care enough to put one, so he stayed with his family on Long Island, who loved him. My grandparents bought him that tombstone, and we never saw him again. I want to believe that he is at rest after that. Tell me what you think. Chef Ben. Our next story of the night comes from Chuck. Chuck's story is called Tape Deck. Chuck says, "Hey Nick, in the previous story I shared with you, I talked about peace symbols and how I was almost possessed by something because of them. My mother's best friend was in that story, and she's in this one too. I'll call her Linda. Years before she'd met my mom, Linda dabbled in the occult, and since then had always had weird things happen to her and her family. Her son and I were best friends growing up, so I was always with them. In the apartment that they lived in, there was a neighbor with serious issues. He was a teen and a couple of years older than I was. I'll call him Carl. His mom I'll call Kathy. Carl had many paranormal stories that blew me away, and he claimed to be completely possessed. Anytime Linda prayed for him and touched his forehead, she burned her fingers. One night I was going to stay the night at Linda's house, like most 12-year-olds would do. About 9 o'clock, Kathy came over just to hang out. She was always seeking counsel from Linda as to what to do with her son. After talking for a while, Linda put on a tape that a pastor had put out dealing with backward masking. If you don't know what that is, it's when you take a record and play it backward on a record player. You can get some freaky messages if you play back the right song in the appropriate spot. Anyway, we sat down and began to listen. The stereo we were listening on was a standard home stereo for the time. This was around 1987, and we were listening to this on a cassette tape. I forgot how long we'd been listening, but it was to the point where I was zoning out because I'd heard this tape before. No one was around the stereo, and there was no remote for it either. There's a part in the tape when the pastor says, "In the book of Ezekiel, the Bible says." At that point, the tape abruptly stopped. I sat up and looked at the tape deck and saw the stop button coming back to its resting position and the rewind button engage. I looked at Kathy and Linda, and they were both as shocked as I was. Linda said, "In the name of Jesus, Satan, I command you to take your hands off my stereo." I looked at the tape deck. The stop button went in, the play button engaged, and the tape began to play again. Like I said, there wasn't a remote for this stereo, and we were all a good distance away from it. I know this may sound hard to believe, but it really happened. I still get goosebumps when I talk about this, and even as I type this out. Thanks for reading. Our next story of the night comes from Lindsay. Lindsay's story is called My Attachment. Lindsay says, "Hello. I first want to say that I'm a huge fan. Thank you for giving us a platform for people to share their stories. My mom's side of the family has been connected with the paranormal for a long time, especially the women. At a very young age, I have witnessed things I couldn't explain, but this story starts when I was 21, when I met my now husband. Only after dating for 4 months, I moved in with him and his family. The basement was our mini apartment in a way. Well, after a month moving in, weird things started to happen. First, I would wake up every night out of a dead sleep, and I don't know why, but I would immediately scan the basement as if to see if there was someone there. I never saw anything until one night. That night when I woke up and scanned the basement, there was a lazy boy chair that was angled toward the basement stairs. Sitting in that chair was a girl, like a teenager or early 20s. I remember clearly she had blonde hair with brown highlights, and she wore a red felt sweatshirt. Without looking at me, she got up from the chair and walked to the stairs. I froze there in fear. I shook my head, thinking that I was dreaming. Somehow, I was able to get back to sleep. The next morning, I talked to my family about what I had seen. They're very open about the paranormal, so I felt comfortable sharing. As I relayed the story, my husband's sister froze, her face turning white. She left the room and came back with her yearbook. She flipped open to a page and pointed to a girl. She asked if this is who I saw. My blood ran cold, and goosebumps spread throughout my body. She relayed to me that this was a friend of hers that died in a car crash the previous year. She still has gifts that her friend gave her. That was the first time I had seen a full-body apparition. I had a hard time sleeping for a few weeks after that. From that incident, a lot more activity picked up. We would see shadows. I would hear my name being called at night, footsteps walking down the stairs and down the hallway on the first floor. They hadn't received this kind of activity until I moved in. One that was very noticeable to me was a strong alpha male presence in the far part of the basement. Our bathroom downstairs had 2 doors, one to our bedroom and one to a different room. I used to go into the other room. I felt this brooding energy, very strong and angry. He didn't like me being down there. He would bang on the door, shake the handle, and try to scare me when I would be in the bathroom. After we got married, we moved out into the place we have now. However, someone decided to follow us. He now resides in the basement. Some brooding and angry feeling. One night while my husband was at work, I was hanging out in the bedroom with our lab, Lucy, just watching TV. All of a sudden we hear the kitchen chair slide across the hardwood floor. She immediately started to growl and snarl at the bedroom door. Other times our kitchen cabinets would open and shut. Doors would close by themselves, and the dogs would follow stuff on the walls and ceilings. The scariest for me was having a music box go off on me when it was turned off and not wound up. Nothing is creepier than a Christmas music box slowly starting to play itself when you're home, alone. Almost every day I have this feeling that something is watching me. Now, the activity has died down a bit. However, from living in this new house, we know it's not just the man. There is a small boy that is here with us. He likes to tug at our clothes to get our attention. He seems pleasant and playful. Sorry for such a long post. This is only the tip of the iceberg. I definitely have had more experiences that I will share with you another time. Thank you again. Our last story of the night comes from Britt. Britt's story is called The Little Girl from the Woods. Britt says, "Hi, Nick. Thanks so much for your podcast. I'm a truck driver, and this keeps me awake during the night shift. I've been eager to share this experience with you, even though I don't normally talk about it. My experience took place in North Carolina at my aunt and uncle's beautiful country estate. I was 17 years old, and it was the second time my family and I took a trip to the state. We're from California. On this particular day, it was around 4:30 p.m., and we were preparing for a huge barbecue. There were about 20 of us, and we were all outside in my aunt and uncle's massive backyard. Anyone who visits North Carolina knows that the majority of the homes are surrounded by the forest. My aunt and uncle had the normal front yard on a main road, but their backyard was a nice 2 acres of flat grass, with the rest being surrounded by an ocean of trees. While the little ones were playing a game of tag, the rest of us were at the long picnic table, chopping potatoes, vegetables, and preparing the fresh-caught deer meat. When everything was prepared to be cooked, my aunt yelled for everyone to go inside, and we could all eat her famous ambrosia while we waited for the actual feast. I was the last one about to step inside, when I noticed one of the little girls was standing in the middle of the grass near the forest. I couldn't make out which cousin this was, which may sound funny, but understand that there was a bunch of aunt and uncles and cousins I had barely met the same day, so I didn't think anything of it. I closed the door behind me and figured I'd go and tell her that we were all told to go inside. As I walked toward her, she began to skip around in circles and talk to herself. I shouted to her that we were told to go inside, but she continued to skip around as if she didn't hear me. As I began to shout again, she stopped and stared at me, which made me stop in my tracks. Oh, okay, she heard me this time, I said to myself. But then she began to skip in circles again, and this time, she started to mock me. Now I was becoming frustrated because she was playing games with me, and I didn't know her well enough to scold her. I told her I was going to tell her mom and dad that she wasn't listening, even though I had no clue which pair of adults she belonged to. As I started to walk toward her again, she started to skip towards the woods. I asked her where she was going and told her that she was going to get in trouble, but she continued to ignore me. At this point, I was already fed up and wanted to try to scare her in the hopes of getting her to turn back. I shouted that it was getting dark and that if she went into the forest, she was going to get lost and never come back. She kept skipping like nothing fazed her, and by now she was already inside the forest, going in deeper and deeper. I looked back at the porch, hoping that someone noticed that we weren't inside, and they were coming to get us, but I could see that everyone was still inside and occupied. I shouted one more time for her to come back, but this time in anger. Nothing. I considered running inside and telling everyone what was going on, but I feared that I would lose sight of her, and then we would really have a problem on our hands. I also knew I would most likely get blamed for it, so, thinking quickly, I decided to run after her. Luckily, my uncle had his hunting trail that was led by red yarn among the trees, so that if he were to ever get lost, he could find his way back. It was only a few feet to the left of me, so I made sure to keep my eye on it while I ran after the little brat. As I was running, I could hear her laughing at me. I continued to yell at her, and I didn't care that it was in a scolding manner. She was going to get us both in trouble. She then started to do this weird thing, where she would circle around a tree before maneuvering into another direction. She did this a few times. After what felt like minutes, I was still trying to catch up to her, when I started to think about how far she was, given the pace I was running, and the pace she was skipping. We were a pretty good distance apart from each other. I stopped to watch her for a second and didn't notice anything unusual. She wasn't skipping fast at all, so how was she so far from me? It was at that moment that she finally stopped and turned around to face me. Somewhat out of breath, I sarcastically asked her if she was done screwing around, and if she was ready to come back with me. She just stood there. As I was looking at her, I then noticed something that I didn't see before, and it threw me off guard. Her skin tone seemed very off. It was very pale, and at the same time, it looked like it had a tint of green. It was getting dark, so I thought maybe the lighting was making her look weird. I caught myself staring at her like a confused weirdo, and quickly shook it off. I told her once more to come back so we wouldn't get in trouble. Still, she said nothing to me, but I could see that she was smiling at me. I was starting to feel uneasy. Why is she acting this way? What's wrong with her? She then raised her arm and pointed at my direction. I didn't understand what she was trying to do. I shrugged my shoulders and asked her what she was pointing at. She just kept smiling at me. I started to feel really creeped out now. She looked so off to me. I then started to even question if I remembered ever seeing her all day. There were at least 7 kids, but was she one of them? It was that same second when I started to examine what she was wearing. Nothing really off about it. She was wearing a yellow flannel shirt with blue jeans and some black boots, but still, I couldn't remember if I had seen her or not. I was done playing games, and I decided I was going back to the house with or without her. That same thought made my heart sink because I realized I wasn't watching where we were going. Still looking at the girl, I finally realized what she found amusing and what she was pointing at. I turned around and couldn't see anything but tall trees. Every direction looked like the same exact layout. I desperately looked around to try to spot the red yarn among the trees, but had no sight of it. I heard the girl laugh at me again, and when I turned to face her, she was gone. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The idea that I was lured by this girl, or ghost, or whatever she was, made me start to cry. I was starting to panic, and began to retrace my steps back to the red yarn, or at least to try to. I was becoming even more desperate when I saw that I was losing sunlight by the minute. A few minutes later, I decided to stop for a second to collect myself. I knew nothing was going to get better if I was in a state of panic. I started to work on my breath and told myself to calm down. It was then that I heard the girl laugh again, only it sounded closer than ever. I froze, and my anxiety came back in an instant. I slowly turned around to face her, but she wasn't there. I looked all around me, but she was nowhere in sight. I quickly continued to walk. Another few minutes later, I lucked out and spotted the yarn a short distance ahead of me. I sighed with relief and began to cry as I started to run toward it. But within seconds of running, I heard her again, but this time her voice was right by my ear. I screamed and my body jolted, causing me to put all my weight onto my ankle. I fell to the ground, and my eyes were closed from the pain. I yelled at the top of my lungs for her to leave me alone. It was then that I opened my eyes, and in front of my face was a pair of small, cut and bruised up feet. My body froze again, and I couldn't breathe at all. I didn't want to look up. I didn't want to see the face, even though I already knew. With just a slight lift of my head, I saw the blue jeans and the yellow flannel shirt. Only now they were torn and had bloodstains on them. Without thinking, I scrambled myself up and limped to the trail as fast as I could. I was screaming and crying for my mom, my dad, and my brothers, anyone that could possibly hear me. I could still feel her around me. I could hear her mocking my cries. I covered my ears with both hands, and I continued to limp around the trees. Finally, I could see the outline of my aunt and uncle's house. Please, God, I kept saying to myself. I was so close, but it was only making me more anxious and scared. I was afraid that she was going to play some other trick on me, so that I couldn't make it back. By the time I had reached the end of the trees, my voice had given out. I was breathing so hard, and was completely exhausted from carrying my weight while limping. After what felt like an eternity, I finally made it to the porch and collapsed on the wooden steps. I was face down, squeezing the steps to my chest, hysterically sobbing. When I had gotten the strength to, I turned around to face the woods. As I expected, the girl was standing by the outside of the forest, staring at me. Her clothes were back to normal, but she still had that demeanor, like what she had put me through was almost satisfying her. I heard the voice of my older brother say, "What are you doing?" I looked up at my brother, who at first looked annoyed until he saw the expression on my face. He quickly came to help me up while asking what had happened to me and where I had been. He sat me down on one of the chairs as he called for my mom and dad. I looked back towards the woods and the girl was no longer there. My brother's yells caused everyone to come outside, which I really wish didn't happen. When my mom and dad came outside and saw the state I was in, they immediately showed concern and asked a series of questions. But as I explained myself, without thinking about the fact that everyone else was listening, I started to notice that the look on their faces was changing from concerned to a look that didn't take me seriously at all. Eventually, even my brother walked away, rolling his eyes. I became infuriated and shouted at all of them that I wouldn't make this up just for kicks. They saw that I was covered in sticks and dirt from head to toe. I was hysterical, even had a minor cut and bruise on my forehead I must have gotten when I fell. I didn't even notice it until my dad mentioned it. After my little breakdown, all my mom and dad had to say was to just relax and go inside and get cleaned up. Everyone else had brushed it off and didn't even bother to ask me about it. Later that night, I had talked to my mom again, and although this time she listened and comforted me as much as she could, I could still feel that she didn't believe me. This made me feel very alone, and I was depressed for the rest of the week of our stay. I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't be alone for more than 5 minutes, unless I was going to the bathroom, and even then, it was difficult for me. I felt bad because I knew that I was putting a damper on the trip for everyone, but I was just miserable, mostly scared, and couldn't wait to get home. The final morning of our stay, I was putting my bags in the car when my uncle approached me. In a quiet tone, he told me that he believed every word I had said about the girl. He continued on to say that he has experienced things in the forest himself, but only when he was alone. His experiences were not to the extent I had, but he knows with all his heart that the forest has dark entities in it. When I had asked him why he didn't say anything that day, he admitted that he didn't want to upset everyone, but more importantly, he doesn't like to think about his own encounters because it still scared him to that day. He then apologized to me for not saying anything about it and for not warning us about going into the forest alone. I hugged my uncle and I began to cry out of relief. It was good to know that I wasn't alone and that I wasn't crazy. I thanked him for telling me, and in that same moment, my dad came out with more bags to put away. He asked if everything was okay, and I played it off and said that I was saying goodbye to my uncle and how I was going to miss him and my auntie. I thought that getting back to California would make everything go back to normal, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Still to this day, now in my later 20s, I sometimes have night terrors about the girl. The strange thing is that when I see her, she is always in her true form, the torn and bloodied clothes, and her cut and bruised skin. Although I don't let my encounter weigh me down these days, I can never forget those terrifying moments. I just continue to move forward by accepting my experience. One thing that is for certain is that I have not since visited North Carolina, or any kind of forest. Thank you to everyone who listened, and thank you again, Nick. As we come to the end of tonight's episode, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for tuning in and supporting the podcast. And a special thank you goes out to Madison, Banya, Tanya, Ben, Chuck, Lindsay, Britt, and our anonymous contributor for writing in and sharing their experiences with all of us. If any of you have thoughts, advice, or a similar experience that you'd like to share with one of tonight's storytellers, you can email me, and I'll be sure to forward your message onto them. If you've witnessed something unexplainable and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. All of our contact information can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a great beginning to your week, and we'll see you back here on Wednesday with our next episode. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, thank you for listening, and remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.